Hello everyone, and welcome to the Temple of Nod, where not all who wander are lost. Okay, so a quick explanation for that little live, laugh, love type moment. So, I'm sure we're all familiar with the story of Cain and how he was sent from the watch of God and from the protection of God into the land of Nod. And this land of Nod is not actually thought to be a land. It's thought to be more of a state of wandering or exile. But in this land, this state of wandering, he found his wife, started a family, built a city, commerce was going through there, and he found his way. So this story of Cain and this land of Nod, the namesake for the temple here, has really put a new spin on that saying, for me personally at least, it has. So, just a quick little snapshot on that little live, laugh, love moment. But anyway, on to the content. So today's video is about a particular person and point in pre-Orthodox Christian history regarding the writing and assembly of the first Bible. I figured we should start here before opening the Bible and going to like the creation myths, which I definitely plan on talking about for sure soon. Just for a little bit of history. Now, there's so much out there already about the history of Christianity and Jesus and the Bible and all of that. So this isn't going to be fully encompassing. This is going to have a strict focus on a gentleman named Marcion and his role in the development of the first Bible, and also the construction of the Bible that we know now. So this part is not really known to the general public. It's very well known within the scholarly and academic circles, especially for biblical studies, obviously, but religious studies overall as well. So I just wanted to bring some attention to this part of the history before we even approach or open the Bible. So, Marcion was a gentleman. He lived in the 1st century over in Sinop, which is Turkey today. In Sinop, he was a fairly successful ship owner and was able to make a fairly decent living off of that industry, and we'll see why that's important later on. This also has an important note because it allowed Marcion to travel, which will again come into play later. So he has the ability to travel, he has the money to travel and to fund things, and eventually Marcion moves from Sinop to Rome during the mid-1st century. At this point, Christianity has already been introduced to Rome. I'm not saying Marcion introduced the religion or anything. And so Marcion was far from the first Christian there. This is a time where there was still no central religious authority in Rome, so there were many different schools of thought in the Christian community in Rome at this time. People were following like the teachings of Valentinus, and, well, eventually Marcion as well, and of course other Gnostic teachers, and those that eventually founded the Orthodoxy as well. They just weren't there yet. So many of them were what we would call heretical today. At first, Marcion was well accepted in Rome. A large part of this was because of his finances. He gave a letter of credibility to some of the Christians there, some of the thinkers there, and to the coming Orthodoxy. I can't remember how much it was originally, but I did the math, and it basically came out to a little over $2 million in today's money. So it was a pretty hefty sum. The main difference is that Marcion had different interpretations of some of the teachings of Jesus than those that soon would found the Orthodoxy. The main one is the whole parable of not putting old wine in new skins. Marcion took this to mean that the teachings of Jesus were new wine, and that the teachings and traditions and practices of Judaism were the old skins. So he wanted them to be completely different traditions. We even see this today a little bit, where Christians will say, well, some Christians will say that the New Testament laws and rules don't apply to them because it's a historical note on the Jewish culture of the time, rather than spiritual guidance or regulations for Christians of today, or Christians in general, even back at the beginning. So, in Marcion's eyes, there should be no Old Testament, because things like the flood, turning people to salt, etc. He believed that the God of the Old Testament was evil and not the true creator God that Jesus came from, and that Jesus came from an entirely different being, which is a staple in different Gnostic schools of thought. So this was the old skin versus the new wine. He believed that Jesus came to save humanity from this demiurgic figure, basically, which, again, prevalent in Gnostic schools. I plan on doing a video on this demiurge idea soon-ish. It's probably going to be a little controversial all around, so buckle up for that. That's going to be fun. Anyway, after Rome, Marcion, he had founded many churches abroad because, again, ships and money. And he went on to do some sort of missionary works with his teachings while maintaining a religious presence in Rome still. Marcionite Christianity was actually very prevalent before the Orthodoxy. Some of its priests were even mentioned among different martyrdom records. Some archaeological evidence has been found. There's one marking that declares a building to be a synagogue of the Marcionites. The term Christian actually was vague, but at the beginning, because Marcion's teachings were so prevalent, Christian was actually applied to the followers of Marcion, so to the Marcionite Christians at the beginning, and other Christian groups adopted the names of the teachers of their traditions in order to differentiate themselves from the Marcionites, who were at the time Christians. Fun fact, before this even, the Romans, who were back in pagan Roman era, they would call the Christians the Sibyllites because of the heavy influence the Sibylline oracles had on Christians at that time. So that's just a very, 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 very brief introduction to Marcion as an individual. So we're just going to skip on to the Bible. So first off, what is a Bible? A Bible is basically just a grouping of scriptures, texts, things like that, that are deemed important and authoritative to any religion. So it's not Christian-specific term. The Bible is very obviously edited, and even today, different versions with different base texts are distributed. So different translations are being used to print and distribute Bibles even today. Now, the Bible is not the same as Scripture or canon either. I'm not saying that Marcion invented Scripture or created canon, or the modern canon. He invented a Bible. He invented a collective of important religious texts for his tradition, Marcionism. He had his own canon for his tradition, and did not invent that. Although there is an argument to be made that there was no Christian-specific canon before Marcion, Christians really just used what books were around and held what they felt was true to the life and teachings of Jesus at that time for their group. So they would vary between the different schools of Christianity at that time. They all had their own different quote-unquote canons. There was no authoritative collective canon. This Marcionite canon included a now lost Gospel of Marcion, although there is a heavily fragmented Gospel of Luke that is thought to be a, well, partially surviving copy of the Gospel of Marcion, but I don't, if I remember correctly, there's not enough on there to really differentiate it from the Gospel of Luke that we know. Along with this Gospel of Marcion, there was the Antithesis, which held the Marcionite theology and some of the traditional Pauline scriptures as well, like Galatians and Ephesians and others. So this collection of scripture is what's considered as the first Bible, the first cohesive collection of scripture. Important to note here is that Marcion's Bible did not actually cause any controversy at the time. What was controversial between Marcion and others was just the interpretation of Jesus' sayings, not the idea or collection of, or decision, I guess, of which books Christians should be following. Because again, no central authority. Everybody kind of had their own collection, their own canon, their own reference material. So from there, we had the idea of a canon actually holding a lot of influence, especially with Marcionites' tradition spreading so far so fast. So because it was so influential, the Orthodox leaders and the followers of the Orthodoxy at this time would eventually push for their own canon, specifically as a response and condemnation of the highly successful canon of Marcion. So the Bible that we know today, it didn't just come out of nowhere as an inspired text. It was assembled and put together and preached as a response to Marcion, this highly influential, quote-unquote, heretic. The Orthodox canon took centuries to become recognized, which we know because the four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John weren't official until the 4th century, and a full agreement on biblical canon wasn't even reached until the 5th century. So this Marcion canon and this beginning was taking place in the middle of the 1st century. Sorry, I have some notes and I just lost my place. So, you might be asking how we know all of this if no surviving copy of the Marcionite Bible has been found. This is something to keep in mind. This note is just something to keep in mind, like, with heresy in general, especially when dealing with the texts of Irenaeus. We know so much about it because of the opponents of this school of thought at the time were trying to belittle these traditions and push for their own to be more prominent, more successful, and quote-unquote the right one. So it was really in their best interest to portray their opposing traditions and theologies and teachings accurately. Because if they just did it and just spewed a bunch of nonsense, they could just come back and be like, we don't do that. We don't believe that. So they tried to just like throw a bunch of sarcasm and shade with accurate representations of what was important to these different pre-orthodoxy groups. So that's important to keep in mind. Just because somebody is opposing or writing against what you believe or what you're looking into and for your path, there might be some accuracy. The only reason that we know about half of these gospels that we ended up finding in the Nag Hammadi, the only reason we even knew they existed was because of some very, very, very passing Bible passages on some of them, but mainly because of Irenaeus. So for me personally, it just makes me a little fuzzy inside to think that all of these people, Tertullian, Irenaeus, and others, who were writing against Gnosticism, their texts are really what preserved it and made it such a high area of interest. So, that's a very quick history of Marcion, the first Bible being written as a response to Marcion, and how the first Bible was really written by a heretic. In the description below, there's a video by a genetically modified skeptic here on YouTube who is much better spoken, much better educated. He did a video on Marcion. I highly recommend you watch it if your interest is piqued by this. This is a very introductory. He collaborated, I can't remember his name, but he collaborated with academic professionals on this as well, and there's a lot more information there, so I put a link to his video there. I think it's only fair to give him credit, and yeah, so thank you for attending our service today, and we'll be back next week.